Good to see a lot of people out here tonight. Thanks for coming to the Austin Mobile and Web Game Dev Meetup. So I'm very excited to have Dan Magaha. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his last name, actually. Dan, how do you pronounce your last name?
Any way you want. It's actually pronounced Magaha, but I don't expect anybody to pronounce that.
Okay. Wow, that's cool. I have no idea. Okay, so I'm glad to have him here speaking tonight. I have a few announcements to make and whatnot, so bear with me for a moment. So obviously this meetup is held on the fourth Tuesday of every month here at Capital Factory. If you're not already on the meetup group, if you haven't already joined the meetup group, please do so. That way you can get updates about future events as we announce them. And let's see. Also, so last month, you guys may or may not know, we had Randy and David from Tiger Style Games speaking. And if you weren't able to make it to that event, I actually recorded the audio of it and put it up on YouTube along with their slides that they used. So feel free to go watch that video. It's kind of long, it's like 2 hours, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. So it's up on YouTube. You can find that if you just go to the meetup and look at the latest announcements in the forum there. You'll see a link to the YouTube channel and where you can watch that video. Also, so we are always looking for speakers for these events. So if you have something that you would like to present that's related to mobile or web game development, definitely get in touch with me. It doesn't have to be a completely finished, perfect, polished game. It could even be something that's sort of a rough thing that you've been working on. You want to get feedback from people about it. Or if you know somebody who's working on something cool that would like to share with this group, definitely get in touch. The best way to reach me is either come talk to me after or on the meetup group. You can say contact the organizer, and that'll send an email to me. So I'll be sure to respond. Also, we are looking for sponsors for these events. So if you are interested in helping support this group so we can keep providing food and drinks and whatnot to the attendees, that would be awesome. It's not expensive. It would just be, a minimal amount, and it would help get the word out about whatever it is that you're wanting to publicize to an audience of enthusiastic game developers in town. So definitely get in touch. Let's see. Also, if you or anyone you know is interested in helping to organize these events, volunteering in any capacity to, pick up stuff beforehand or help spread the word about them or help book speakers or whatever, I'm totally game for that. I've been kind of running it solo for about a year, but if anybody wants to help, that would be awesome. So let's see, what else? So you may or may not know that it's possible to park in the parking garage here at the Omni. It's underneath the hotel, and you can get a discount for parking down there if you ask the attendant up here in the Capital Factory waiting area, say that you want a validation ticket, and they will give you one, and then it'll just be $5 to park for the night instead of like some crazy amount, like $5 an hour. Yes.
As long as you park after 6 o'clock.
Yes, that's key. Good point. Thank you.
I circled the block for 10 minutes.
so that would apply. Yeah, that's a good thing.
Probably spent 6 hours in gas. So.
Yeah, sure. Right. Let's see. So one more thing. Before these events, I always like to give people an opportunity to stand up and announce if they are looking to hire someone in the area of mobile or web game development or game development in general, or if you're looking for someone to collaborate with on a project in that area. So if anybody wants to stand up and say who they are and what they're looking for, that would be the time to do that. Yeah, go for it.
Everybody, real quick. I've got a fighting game app, and I need a GUI designer. Somebody who's worked maybe with monetization before, just kind of, and probably working with me to kind of lead the way. graphic design. I should be helping with the design, so I need more of the graphics. But just talk to me afterwards. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, go for it.
I'm making a game to teach kids math. It's on the web, and I don't have money to pay anyone, including myself, right now. But if that sounds interesting to you, come talk to me.
Cool. And you are? What's your
Jeffrey.
name? Okay. Yeah. And what's your name again?
Ross.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hey, I'm Martin. I'm developing a rock climbing game. I got all the graphics and some basics in Unity, but I need someone skilled in Unity to help me with the physics, because the rock climbing piece is kind of physics intense. So I can either pay you, or you can work with me, and we'll figure it out. Just talk to me after. Thank you.
That's a cool idea. Very unusual topic for a game.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'm Mark. I just moved to the area. I'm part of a small startup. We're doing some interesting non-gaming things with Unity, doing some crazy simulation stuff. And I need someone fairly technically savvy with Unity for doing art tech type stuff. So if anyone's interested, give me a shout.
Cool. Anyone? Oh,
Yeah, so this is my first time here, so I just thought, since you guys are all game developers, I've actually been working on an open source joystick library to help the game development world not have to deal with the pains of joysticks. And if you're interested in helping further that project, it's called FreeStick. You can find it at Bitbucket, or you can see me afterwards.
Cool. And you're actually with?
Oh, I'm the lead developer at GameSalad, so.
So he's legit.
Alleged.
Anyone else? Oh, actually, yeah. So that's the next thing I was going to say is that. Yeah, John is excited to tell everyone about a cool event that's coming up. There happens to be a lot of interesting, cool things related to game development and startups and whatnot happening right now in Austin in the fall time period. And one of them is the Captivate conference, and John Henderson would like to say a few words about that.
Okay, so this is happening October 24th, 25th, and 26th. It's the weekend before Halloween, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's happening at the Highland Mall. And it is a convergent media professional development conference, which is a fancy way of saying you do artistic and entertainment things with technology and you don't get ripped off. The idea is that there are lots of industries within that very broad brush, but they don't talk to each other. There are lessons that the game industry has learned that other industries don't, and vice versa. And while we are a bunch of game industry folks, primarily we do have lots of friends who are doing animation and music and all other sorts of things. And in fact, Austin is that sort of hub, so we wanted to celebrate it as well as inform people as much as possible. So there's going to be talks, meetup events, panels, and all kinds of things going on. Tickets are now on sale, and I have handbills if you want to take home so you remember where to go on the website. It's captivateconference.com.
It's the second year, right?
Second year.
Yeah, what's up? You want to ask something?
So if I want, let's say I don't have any money, and like I still want to go, what can I do?
Well, there is a link on the website called Volunteer. You can click on that, and if you're willing to commit to some time, then we'll get you a badge.
That's definitely an option for you.
And a shirt.
And a shirt. You get 2 shirts.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to go just because, I don't know, for some of you, if you remember the old Austin Game Developers Conference that used to be here, and is no longer here, and it was kind of a big loss for us. And Jennifer Bullard, who is putting on the Captivate Conference, it was her brainchild, and John and many of others from the local IGDA chapter have been helping her out. It's kind of a big deal to try and replace that conference, or not replace it in a literal sense, but to continue the tradition of having a game conference here in town, because we are still a important hub for game development, and just because. Who owns GDC? Is it IDC? Or
Yeah, it's a parent company for Gamasutra.
So they want to take
California people.
California people want to take their conference away. That's fine. We can do our own thing. So, but a lot of people work really hard on it. So I highly recommend you go if you can.
The good news about Austin is that there are always things like this, having efforts to bring people together but one guy can only do so much. So we're trying to do it, and this is Austin, we also have South by Southwest, and Rooster Teeth has their expo, but this is this time of year, and we think it's a good idea. So everyone is oftentimes fumbling around in the dark to find someone who has that bit of information, a little bit of insight that can mean the difference between success or failure, or those people that you absolutely need but you don't know how to get. Please look us up.
And it's a lot cheaper than South by Southwest. Anyway.
Absolutely. Or even GDC Online.
Yeah.
Local.
Yeah, and local. Yeah.
Right.
So I guess without further ado, I'll go ahead and get to Dan. So just as a rough idea of how things will unfold, he's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then have maybe 15 to 30 minutes of Q&A afterwards. If you have any questions while he's talking, feel free to interject, I guess, as long as it's roughly relevant to kind of what he's touching on at that point. And if you think that it's kind of more of a out of left field kind of question, you can just hold it until the end. And Dan has tons of experience in the game industry. He's worked on many amazing projects and has a lot of wisdom to share. And I guess I'll let him do his kind of introduction and background stuff. But yeah, take it away.
Thanks, everybody. When Todd originally asked me to do this, he was like, yeah, just come to the meeting and talk for a few minutes about GameSalad. I was like, cool, I'll just show up. I didn't realize that I was going to be the main attraction. So I tried to just kind of jot down some thoughts and some experiences from my time making games, and it kind of occurred to me, Todd asked me, what's your theme going to be? And I started thinking back, to the beginnings of when I started making games, which was 99, and I realized that the concept of prototyping and iterating and rapidly working on new things is something that was really early ingrained in me. In the place that I got into the game industry. And Todd and I were talking back to back about there's some great stories about how that's worked, and there's also a lot of stories where you tried something and you're like, wow, this completely bombed, and we shut a studio down or whatever. And in the old days you wouldn't really talk about that in games. It was like you didn't really talk about failure. It was just only like, oh, so what's the last game that you shipped? And if your last game didn't ship, it was like this black mark on your resume, and you just sort of were like, well, we were working on an R&D project or something. But now everyone's like, fail fast, and it's okay to fail, and talk about your failures, and there's great things to learn, which is awesome because I have a lot of failures to talk about. So it's great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experiences with prototyping. As I said, I started in '99. I started working at a company called 4-Axis Games in Baltimore. Worked for a guy that most people know, Sid Meier. This was kind of like a dream come true for me because I grew up playing his games. And I wasn't, at that time, I wasn't a game developer. I was a web developer for a consulting company. And they actually hired me to do an online store for them and some marketing stuff. And so I thought this was awesome because I was going to get to learn, how games were made and kind of see, how the sausage is made. And so it kind of started from there, and then eventually became a producer, worked on a bunch of stuff there, and then got tired of snow, and so moved to Austin and, kind of bounced around from place to place, NCSoft, and then did a couple of smaller things. And now I'm at GameSalad, where I'm the director of operations, which is a fancy way of saying that, I just make sure that the bills get paid and that our developers get everything they need to keep writing awesome code. So, let's see here. Does this actually work? No, probably not. So we'll just kind of do it manually. My contact info is there. I'll leave it up at the end in case we want to talk more about that. So, figured we'd start off. I assume that most people probably, have a pretty good understanding of prototyping and what it is and why you're interested in it. But I thought this was interesting because, depending on what first got you into prototyping, you may have a very different idea of what it actually is to you. But you look it up. The dictionary definition is a first or preliminary model of something, especially machine, from which other forms are developed or copied. I think the Greek root word there is interesting, primitive form. A lot of times our primitive forms end up becoming shippable code that customers are using, and you kind of go, wait a minute, how did that happen? This was supposed to be our primitive form, and now it's our shipped product. What are some types of prototypes? There's surprisingly no sort of standard definition of what the different types of prototypes are. But you've seen all these different types of things before. Proof of concept. You want to see, does this particular gameplay mechanic, is it fun? You want to prove out, whether a particular type of product is something that people will buy. That's a form of a prototype. Feasibility study, where you're actually, on an engineering or a usability type of test, trying to figure out, does this do what we think it's going to do? Is it something that we can actually manufacture? Is it something that we can make money on? Those are all things that are prototype driven, because again, you're building something that is not your full scale product. You're just doing a small scale version in some form. UI wireframes, which have been referred to as horizontal prototypes, because you're oftentimes just building something that covers the sort of top layer of all of your user interaction. It doesn't actually do anything behind the scenes, but you might actually, test how users interact with it or how it feels. And then the favorite term of game developers everywhere, by favorite I mean hated, vertical slice, which is a word that publishers use when they mean we want you to do twice as much work in the same milestone. And what vertical slice means is we want you to do an entire level or an entire aspect of the game from top to bottom at a polished level that represents what the game actually is. And the idea is supposed to sort of prove that your art style is good, and that your design ideas are on point, and that basically this game is going to be a hit. And what it really ends up doing is it ends up basically proving that you can essentially make a miniature, crappier version of your game in a compressed time frame. But that is a form of a prototype. It's just not a very useful one for game developers. You know what? I should probably do play, and then I can do this. Okay. Look at that. Okay. So what problem are you trying to solve? Again, we've talked about some of these things. Are you trying to prove the feasibility or viability of an idea? Another thing that you can use a prototype for is identify your own blind spots and assumptions. So, you build something, you think that it's awesome, and you're like, everyone's going to love this because I love this. And then you put it out there and it turns out that, you and 10 people like it and not everyone. So that's a great way, a great reason to use a prototype is before you go and decide that you're going to spend, thousands of dollars on building out this game idea that you think is perfect. Maybe you want to find out, how many people really feel the same way that you do. Help illustrate and explore possibilities. Again, sometimes you build something and it's just kind of a fun toy, and you put it out there, and other people go, "Oh wow, this is really cool." I'm thinking of all kinds of things that that you had never thought of. And a great example that comes to mind right now is the Oculus VR headset. Is a prototype kit, and people are making demos for it, and all kinds of really wild stuff is happening. They could not possibly have ever imagined all the different applications that people would have for it, but they build a prototype and put it out there, and other people are that's spurring all kinds of other interesting developments and ideas. Using constraints as creative catalysts. This is your game jam, right? So a lot of times I hear from younger, more inexperienced game developers, one of the surest signs of how long somebody's been making games is when they start talking about their game idea. If it's a well, first it's going to do this, and then it's going to do this, and also we're going to have a completely customizable player character that's going to have full-skinned armor, and the inventory is going to have this, or we're going to have a full, complete questing system, and they're going to be able to have kids, and they're going to be able to get married, and they're going to have player housing, and it's going to run on all platforms. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. You have never actually talked about the constraints that you're going to have to, live with in order to build your idea. So One of the things that's great about game jams is you have these constraints, and sometimes you do a game jam, you know that the constraints are artificial. It's not like somebody is going to kill you if you don't get your game done on time, but you're agreeing to it because you want to compete in the same competition that everyone else is. But the cool thing about constraints is it gives you it kind of lets you off the hook from having this blank piece of paper where you can put anything into your game. So that's an example of where prototypes are a great benefit. Is you can't possibly do everything even if you want to, so you're going to have to choose to basically whittle some things down in order to meet those constraints. Portfolio planning just means I got a bunch of different ideas. Which one should I do? Make some prototypes, figure out which one seems like the most fun, or subjectively or objectively. Finding the fun, again, same type of idea. This is where I learned about prototypes from Sid Meier, which was the guy would just literally get an idea on a Friday, and then we'd come in on Monday and it would be like, I want you guys to play this and tell me what you think. And you're like, how long have you been working on this? It's like Saturday night and Sunday night. It's just that was what he would do. And it was all about figuring out what was fun about it, what wasn't fun about it. Sometimes something that you didn't even think was supposed to be the core of the idea would turn out to be the part that was really fun, and that would become a totally different game. So I'm going to talk about one of those cases in the presentation here. But most likely, the real reason that you're prototyping is because you want to save time and or money. Because if you had all the time and money in the world, of course, you wouldn't need a prototype. You can just do everything all the way, and that would be perfect, because then you could put all of those awesome features in. Except that there's probably, I don't know if there's many great examples of it, but there are plenty of games that had almost unlimited budgets and they were still terrible because throwing everything in doesn't necessarily make a great game. So a lot of times your reason for going to prototyping is to save time and money, but it may actually end up, or should end up, helping you have a better game in the long run. And why does it save you money? Because he who hesitates is over budget. This is your schedule. This is your cost of development and your phases of development. And this is sort of an old school chart from the systems development life cycle, which is the awful stuff I did before I got into games. But basically, what it means is if you figure out that you've got a problem here when you're doing your requirements, it's a lot cheaper to fix than when you figure out here and it's in the hands of users. That's just kind of common sense, but what's not common sense is that what does it mean to have a problem? Well, a lot of times what it means to have a problem is you've made assumptions, or you have gotten the requirements wrong, or something that seemed like it was a good idea turns out to not be a good idea. And when you're doing a very linear or waterfall style development, you may not know that until the time that you're in coding or testing. But if you're doing something in a prototype fashion, what you're really doing is taking a small piece of work, making that into its own project, and say we're going to build this cheaply, fast, to test a certain thing that we want to test. Then when we figure out what we wanted to learn, we've saved a bunch of money because we're not going to find this here. Problem is, and for a lot of you folks, you're probably working for yourselves or in a smaller team. It's not a big deal, but the problem is always how do you convey this to the bean counters who are saying, well, you want how much time to just build something that you're going to just throw away, So that's always an ongoing challenge, and I've fallen victim to that many times myself. Okay, the screenshot here is a very early screenshot of a game called Sid Meier's Sim Golf, which is not a particularly well-known game of Sid's, but is actually a really interesting one if you get a chance to play it. I have it up here for a couple different reasons. One is it kind of illustrates the point I was making before about sometimes when you're prototyping, you set out thinking that the fun part of a game, or you think your hypothesis is this is what's fun about my game idea. And then if you really have the courage to follow your process and let players tell you what they liked and didn't like, it can take you in all kinds of strange directions. This game actually grew out of 2 or 3 failed attempts to make a dinosaur game. Of course. I swear to God, this was the terrain. This was the dinosaur game terrain, and the first version of the dinosaur game was like a Pokemon style game. It was trading cards, but there was a map, and then that really wasn't that much fun. And so then, like, we went away on Friday, and we came back in on Monday, and he was like, I totally changed the game, and now it's we always had these code names, and so that one was Dinomon, and then they said now it's Dinocraft, and it's kind of like Warcraft, and we're like, sweet, this is awesome. Everyone loves RTS, and there's like dinosaurs running around, and this is going to be awesome. And there was a terrain, and a lot, and then you could manipulate the terrain, and a lot of us were sitting there manipulating the terrain and like putting all these different terrain features in because it would impact how the dinosaurs were moving, and that actually became more fun than playing the dinosaur game. And he just couldn't find a way to make a game that he really liked, and then on top of that, he just got like super hooked on golf. And so we came in on Monday, and it was like, we wanted you to try this new build, and we were expecting another version of the dinosaur game, and it was a golf game. We were like, what is this? And I think, the executable was still called like dino.exe, and like there was still dinosaur art on the title screen and stuff, and we were like, what is going on? But it was a golf game, and it was amazing. Like, I've never played golf in my life, and I was hooked. Everybody in the studio, like whether they liked golf or not, they were like, this is just really mesmerizing. And obviously there was a lot of iteration on that gameplay. There was a lot of iteration on getting it to to where it was here, and then it took a step further, and then the corporate guys got involved, and it became a sim game because Sims were hot at that time, and it had nothing to do with the Sims. But anyway, the important point here is just that that was the evolution of a game that had absolutely nothing to do with something else. The other interesting thing about this is that, and I kind of talk about this a little bit later, but Sid was notorious for having code that he could reuse somewhere else. I couldn't figure out how he was able to make a game about golf. Like, this was a 2D. Eventually they put it into a 3D engine, but in this implementation, it was basically an isometric 2D game. And he had all this sophisticated like golf swings, and you watch the ball, and you just watched it. You couldn't control where the balls were going to go, but you would watch the golfers hit, and it looked like, I was like, man, how did he figure out how to make all these golf balls look natural and everything? And he was like, oh, well, we used the code from Gettysburg for cannonball fire, because it's the same basic, it was like this. Of course you did. That makes perfect sense. So, he reused stuff and was able to build something very quickly, and the rest is history. Key point of this slide for game development, what is the core fantasy of your game, or the joy of your game? Joy. That's John Henderson all the way. And it's different depending on whether if you have an abstract mechanical type of game, a puzzle game, or something that is more of a sort of action game that doesn't necessarily have a setting or a story, then it might actually be about that moment and what you're doing and why it's fun. If you've got a thematic or narrative game, it's what about that story? What about that world that you're putting players in? What is it that you're offering the player that is different and unique and grabs them? Once you figure out what that is, you lock that down, and then that becomes the thing that you're going to measure against. If, like Sim Golf at some point, or at Dinosaurs, at some point you go, well, I thought my theme was this, and we've kind of gone like this, and now it's no longer anywhere near that. You can change it. You can definitely go take a detour, but if you feel like that thing is what you're trying to do, keep measuring, and if you start to go off the path, you need to make a decision. Do I go back and reevaluate because I really, really, really want to deliver this particular, experience to a player, or do I follow, where the path is leading? Obviously, I can't answer that question for you, but that the important thing is to be aware of it and and make a decision rather than just sort of get led somewhere and then have no participation in it. one good game is better than two great ones. People misquote this all the time. That's a Sid truism. He says this all the time, and people are like, "Oh, what you really mean is one great game is better than two good ones." And he actually means this, which is he calls this the covert action rule, but it also applied to the dinosaur game, which is if you have dueling themes or dueling systems or essentially different types of gameplay that are both really fun, even if those are really great, if both of those are living simultaneously in the game, it's a distracting experience for the player. And it's better to have one gameplay experience that maybe isn't amazing, but it's solid, than have two really great ideas that are constantly fighting for the player's attention.
So like not having a racing game and an RPG in the same story?
I mean, there's all kinds of exceptions, don't get me wrong, but I think the degree of difficulty of pulling it off is definitely much higher when you've got, two really strong themes or ideas or mechanics that are pulling the player back and forth. In the case of covert action, which I don't know how many people are familiar with that game. I actually love the game, but it was a spy thriller type game. But there were all these different little mini games, and some of them were so intense and they took so much time that by the time you got done one, you kind of forget what you were doing in the first place before you went into it. And that's kind of why he calls it the covert action rule, is that you would you have. It was better to have a game that really didn't go too deep. You can have an RPG and a racing game, but if you're building an RPG that's as deep and feature filled as a Dragon Quest and a racing game that's that's Forza, it's like those two things are both so meaty that it's going to probably detract from the players. Like, what type of game am I playing here? But again, it can be pulled off. But this is just my take on it. Don't fall in love with pet features. Doesn't matter how cool the idea was to you. If it sucks, if people don't like it, be willing to kill it. Turn the computer off. This is something that we have a real problem with these days, I think, because technology is so awesome. And if you're like me, you hate writing stuff down. It's like I'd rather type it. One of the games I worked on, I wish I had a picture of the process, but I've got a screenshot of a prototype in another slide. One of the games I worked on for Access that did not ship was a outer space economic mining and trading and espionage simulator. And as you can imagine, publishers were having a hard time getting their head around that. But we prototyped that game before any code was written, entirely on a whiteboard. We drew, it was a turn-based, originally it was turn-based and then it became real-time, but it was a grid-based game, and it was kind of like Mule, and you would survey plots of land, and then you would find out what was under it, and then you would make decisions. And so we prototyped it on the whiteboard, drawing a grid, and writing some resources on the grid, and then putting post-it notes on top of the grid squares. And then we had a bunch of the team come in, and we took turns, and we were like, I want to take that square, and here's what you get. And you write down on a piece of paper, I'm going to take that square. And then every turn, we would sort of talk about what we were going to do. And it was very interesting because even though the game was going to be a real-time game, even though there was a lot of mechanics we couldn't simulate, there was things that right away somebody said, oh, there's a really great plot of land, we should have an auction for it. And so we were just sitting in the room, we're like, well, let's have an auction. And it was like, fine, I'll bid 100, I'll bid 200. And immediately we're like, this is really fun, we got to get this in the game, because when's the last time you played a game where you were like bidding against your friends like in real time, and there's this, it's like eBay, right? It's like you don't want to get outbid at the last minute. That was when eBay was really exciting, so it's probably old hat now. But anyway, that was a really, really, really useful thing. You also limit how much trouble you can get yourself into, because you can't go away for 3 weeks and write code if you're sitting in a room with a whiteboard and the entire team's there, and half the team members are going, this is really not fun, we should probably not do this. But if you have a programmer, then you're like, hey, go and implement this system, and they spend 3 weeks fighting with Unicode, and you're like, oh my god, I want to kill myself, why do we do this? This is a great way to avoid that problem. Another thing that's cool about this is you get a chance to put your hands on physical objects, and it reconnects you and reminds you of the genius of things that you're using every day that you probably take for granted. A lot of times when we're only working in the digital world, we forget about, so many things that we use every day and what's cool about them, what's not cool about them. We make games that approximate real physical objects, but then half the time we don't even remember, like, what is the cool thing about this object? Like, what's, you watch kids play with, my kids, it's like, my wife and I, buy them toys that we think they're gonna like, and what do they wanna play with? A box of like old junk that we have in the guest bedroom. So, and it's just because the interesting, like, what can I do with this? And what can I do with that? And you watch them and you're like, wow, I never even thought about how interesting that is. So there's all kinds of unusual places that you can find inspiration that will, give you ideas and help take your prototype in different directions. I actually have a link to a talk, a really great talk, YouTube, from Casual Connect this year in my slide deck. This is the screenshot I was telling you about. This is the prototype of the game I mentioned earlier. Again, it's a tile-based game. This is like way early. Super ugly, but as you can see, it kind of looks like a stock market ticker with a weird grid on top of it. But that game, we built that game up to a really, really, really complicated, not complicated, but a very mature game in a very short period of time because the entire team just loved playing the game. We played it constantly, and it's one of the things that I always recommend when you're prototyping is get a group of people together. I always recommend, I'm going to contradict myself in the next slide, so I always recommend, make sure that you have new users constantly test your game so that you don't, get into a situation where everybody knows all the warts and you just ignore it. You want to make sure that new users are giving you feedback all the time. But there's no substitute for having a dedicated group of people who really love the idea and just play it constantly, because that energy, it's hard to quantify on an objective level, but that energy and that excitement of we played yesterday and this happened and I really want to see what happens today when we put in this, it was palpable. This game, I probably shouldn't say too much about it because it was never developed, but it was we built multiplayer before there was ever any AI. And that was another thing that was really interesting is that, I was the producer on the project and I was like, we don't have time for multiplayer. We've got to get something that we can test. And the designer on this project is a guy by the name of Soren Johnson, who designed Civ 4. And one of the things he said, which I thought was really fascinating, is he said, well, if we do multiplayer, we don't have to build AI for a really long time because that will be our AI. And it will be the best AI that we'll ever have because it's going to be real players. And that was brilliant because AI was the last thing that we put in, and of course, we didn't end up making the game, so we didn't spend a bunch of time on an expensive AI. But we had all these great play tests where we were constantly challenging each other, finding ways that the game was fun that we never thought it was going to be fun, and it was just a really great experience. Double or Have It is another Sid special, which is just a fast way of saying don't ever bother with like, I'm going to change this attack value by 10%. Like, no one is going to notice or care. 50%, 200%, don't bother with 5% and 10%. I think when he first mentioned this, the way he described it was you're more wrong than you think, and you're going to get a much better reaction when you double something or have it. It's going to be much faster, much a better iteration when you do that, as opposed to messing around with a bunch of sort of incremental numbers. When you're in alpha and you're balancing lots of playtest feedback, that's the time that you want to turn the dials very gently. But when you're in prototype, man, just do crazy stuff. Ironically, also, this game went on to become the engine that was used for Civ 4. The very first version of Civ 4 had completely smooth terrain. There were no grids. Well, there was a grid, but it was overlaid over top of rolling hills and rivers. And so the very first version of Civ 4 had like really strange stuff where like you would have a tile that was like 22% river and 60% mountain and 20% grassland, because it was just completely sort of free form, and it was really interesting. Ultimately, they could not balance it, and so they kind of went back to the very jagged tile-based approach. Advocate for the player throughout. In keeping with the themes here, another SID special is a game is a series of interesting decisions. Most people have heard that before. The key point here is interesting. If you got players making decisions and there's nothing interesting about them, then get rid of it. Why are you asking players to care about it? Is the player having fun, or is the designer having fun? This is another big one, is that there are so many games where you'll play and it's like, we used to have this AI programmer who's like, this AI is going to kick your asses. And I'm like, that's great. Like, I really wanted to get my ass kicked today. Why are you having more fun than me? Render unto Intel the things that are Intel's. What this means is, think about what our computers really good at, right? Like the very first version of Civilization was an adaptation of an Avalon Hill board game. The whole reason that Sid created that game was he really loved the board game, but there was a lot of keeping track of things, and it was like, I don't like keeping track of all this stuff. And it seems to me that a computer would be really good at keeping track of this stuff. So that's what computers are really good at, keeping track of stuff that people don't like to memorize stuff. That's boring. But what people like to do is make interesting decisions. So make sure that your game is letting the computer do what it does best, and then giving the player the fun things that the player likes to do. That doesn't mean that you should dumb your game down to where there's no numbers in it or no data in it. It just means that, and I know that there are a lot of German micromanagement games that would strongly disagree with me, but I think there is a finite limit to how much people will care about numbers and micromanagement. Kleenex testing is a phrase that just means a user that's never used your game before. Kleenex meaning you use it and then toss it in the bin and it's never to be used again. The idea being that contrary to the previous slide where I said you've got to have a group of people who are constantly playing your game, you also have to balance that by having new people come in who have no expectations, no biases. Just have them come in periodically, play your game, and give you feedback. You will probably get a lot of stuff that you don't care about, and that's fine. But you will also get a bunch of stuff that you have completely forgot about that's been in your face for like 6 months and you've just forgotten about or learned to live with. So that's always a good practice.